Well, thank you for having me. My name is Matthew Morookian. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at Apex Analytics. And I presented at ASCM's show in Austin about, I guess it was a year and a half ago. And was asked to present on this webinar. And it finally has come to being. It's finally here. And I probably did not meet anyone on the call at the show. I would love something, since I don't know you, I'd love you to put your name, maybe you put your first name and your title and maybe where you work or something along those lines just in the chat. And I just wanted to see kind of like who's here because I see Brian, but I don't know who Brian is. And if I see some titles, might give me some ideas of stories that I could share. And so I said earlier, I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. So I'm a New Englander. So does that count towards anything here? I ran away from the cold. I don't know how cold it is uh, in New England right now. Let me just figure out how to share. And we'll go. Sorry, 1 second. Oh, there we go. I just had the request to share. So customs manager. Sales, supply chain, Texas Instruments. Okay. And just to confirm, everyone can see my screen. Yes. Okay, great. And I just want to see if I could pull up that chat too. So I just have it. Thank you. And thanks for everyone sharing. Demand planning, material planner, some large companies. Some companies I see are clients. I can't say who they are um, in the public forum, but it's good to have all your chapters here today. And I heard some other people from around the world. So it's good to chat with you. Now, I put my email here. Reach out on LinkedIn if you want to chat. Love to talk with you. I want to just give you a background of myself and a little bit on Apex Analytics for your perspective. So I've been with the company for 7.5 years in a product marketing role. I work with clients in telling stories at conferences and webinars, trying to help with educational content so practitioners can share with practitioners. We do have a conference in April called Icon. It's usually about 150 people. It's in Scottsdale, and we'll have a ton of session content similar to this there. Prior to this role, I was at a consulting firm focused on IoT, really the connectivity side. So think about cellular and satellite connectivity, but 10 years ago. And then I transitioned to product marketing at Apex. And so Apex is, let's see. Okay, here we go. Apex, really brief, um, 35 years in the accounts payable recovery audit space. I didn't see one person put AP recovery or AP in their title. Um, we started in that space. We're actually the largest accounts payable recovery audit firm in the world. And about 10 years ago, one of our clients came to us and said, we have tons of suppliers and we need to onboard them in a more efficient way. And so we built a supplier onboarding risk management solution with them. And that was about 10 years ago to cover really the globe. They operate in about 70 countries. And now we have about 100 different clients leveraging the tool. And earlier this year, we were recognized by Gartner as a leader within the supplier risk management space. And so that's where I kind of come to this, say, hey, what do we want to talk about? We want to talk about reputation and risk. And when I talk to clients, a lot of companies are just scared of, hey, if we're doing business with someone we shouldn't be doing business with, if they're not above the line, if they aren't holding the ethics to our standards or even any regulatory standards, then it could impact their business. And the fines aren't going to be as great as the reputational loss, reputational damage that could impact sales. And so we come in from a space of trying to help companies, one, be efficient with onboarding and managing suppliers, but also helping them react or proactively have our tools react on behalf of them to manage risk. And so that's a snapshot. I could go into Apex, but that is not what this session is for. This is some of our data points. We've been in business for 35 years. I'll skip over this and just jump into some data. So looking at some data, we talk about fraud, fines, and inefficiencies. And looking at fraud, this is from ACFE, that's the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. And the average loss is almost $2 million. And you think, okay, I'm in supply chain. What does fraud matter to me? I don't know. I'd love anyone to say if fraud has impacted their business, if they have a story. And hey, if you want to jump on and tell your story, it doesn't just have to be me talking. Um, and, I hear different companies, fraud impacted our supplier because, it soured the relationship. Things like that, because who's responsible? And you can get into the nitty-gritty of it. And I'll tell some stories later on. And then fines, we'll be talking about some OFAC fines. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Asset Control. Some of you may be aware of it, some of you may not, but part of the US federal government. Average fine was $3 million. And that was in 2023. I looked at the 2024 numbers. It was a little below that, but not too much. I think it was a 2.2 or so. And so these are real fines for large companies, and we'll talk about why people are getting them. And lastly, inefficiencies. We did a survey about a year ago, and it was with over 200 people. And how are they onboarding suppliers? And 77% of them said they're onboarding through with reliance on email. And what this reliance on email is, hey, sending a PDF and someone filling out the information and then sending it back, or having them go to a portal and fill out some information and then rely on email to send more additional information. And the reliance on these manual processes kind of limit the scope of what you're able to collect. Also makes things much longer, much more manual. So when you think about, hey, I want to onboard a supplier and I need to collect their tax ID. Well, if I have it in PDF, then I have to go to a website, take that, confirm that it's with that actual company, and then it just takes more and more time. And so when we view kind of like what's feed like creating fraud, fines, and inefficiencies, it really is uh, it really is manual processes. And so I took this quote from one of our clients. We named the enemy. I like always, got to be big. We named the enemy manual processes. And it's just a bunch of these tasks listed below, and they just add up. I'm sure if someone wants to write in the chat what's their least favorite manual task that they have to do, they could share and everyone would know what it is because they have to do something similar. But what I have talked to companies, one area that we sell into a lot is finance, and um, this relates to different data validations, but bank account information is a key data point that they have to validate, and they find that spending a lot of time to validate that information is critical, but it also just takes up a lot of time for high value associates, and so when you have to do all these, it just kind of hinders your ability to execute on maybe larger picture items or larger projects and require more people. And so this manual processes is always kind of what we're thinking of. How do we remove this? How do we automate? How do we make it easier? Um, and I love stealing quotes from clients. So let's jump into some data. So from 2023, OFAC, um, they had 17 fines, 17 large companies. And, uh, when you think about those companies, they're all global because the Office of Foreign Asset Control. They had 1.5 billion in fines, and there's an outlier within there. There's a cryptocurrency firm that doesn't operate in the US anymore that was almost a billion, and the rest were about 500 million. So it's 968 million. So when you think about these fines, $1 billion for a fine. And we look at, okay, so what were the themes within these? So the first one is it's global. So many of these companies are large, but then they also acquire companies. So they acquire smaller companies, or they have subsidiaries that are in regions that are more likely to have entities that you can't do business with. And when we think about OFAC, and I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, but OFAC kind of says you can't do business with this person or this company. And since the Ukraine war, several thousand entities have been added onto their lists. And there's about between 13 and 15,000 entities on their list. And when you look at some of them have DBAs that could be, 50 different DBAs because those companies that you're not supposed to do business still want to make money. So they have a different DBA, and then eventually it gets found out and added to the list. So um, OFAC kind of says, okay, you can't do business with them. And what doing business with them is paying them. And so they're all going to be global companies just by the nature of who OFAC is looking at and trying to restrict business with. So those subsidiaries are maybe in regions that are closer to areas that have a lot of entities on the OFAC list. And there's several different lists too. And, it just is around payments. And the thing about payments is we looked at that cryptocurrency firm. It had such a large fine because it was fining the company per payment. So if you have a peer-to-peer, you know, uh, technology firm or, a platform, which I really mean, and these are being made without any controls, then it can quickly add up. But when the companies find out that they have paid someone, they have to voluntarily disclose that they paid someone they shouldn't have paid. And so when we looked at some of these instances, a company said, hey, we actually did business with someone we shouldn't be doing business with. They tell OFAC, and then OFAC has an investigation and determines, hey, you didn't just pay them one time, you paid them 37 times, or you paid multiple different entities. You paid multiple different entities you shouldn't be doing business with. So this is kind of some of the themes I saw when I was looking into some of the data on OFAC's website. And so I kind of ask to everyone, how often are you checking your suppliers against prohibited lists? Is anyone doing that? Are they looking at different prohibited lists and saying, once a year, or trying to look at the chat to see if anyone's responding? But if anyone is doing that, or is that a concern, or maybe they have an internal list, because typically it could be OFAC, it could be the FBI. We have about 100 different lists that we look at, and they're all from different government agencies throughout the world. And many times a client, they'll have a internal prohibited list because they worked with a vendor, and it seems like someone says they do help with that and they do some continuous monitoring. Yeah, so when we look at this, I put this up as like usually kind of the different categories that people may look at, you know, the different answers that they may give to this question. I typically see once a year. Um, it will be at onboarding, and then once a year is what many companies say when they answer this question. So I wanted to look at some data to see how often is this really happening in the real world. So I looked at two clients of ours. One has 6,000 suppliers, one has 64,000 suppliers. And here's the data. So they're pretty similar for each. And flagged is FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, combined with the prohibited list. And what the Financial Action Task Force is flagging is that suppliers are in regions, countries that don't have the standard money laundering controls that they would require. And so one of those companies is the Philippines, and a lot of companies are doing business with companies in the Philippines. So um, this flag isn't necessarily, hey, a critical alert, but it is something that you should be aware of. And some companies are going to treat it differently than other companies. And then when you look at the prohibited list, 0.5% and 0.1%. 0.1% is about 60 entities failing prohibited list check. Now, 60 entities, if you need 60 payments or 10 to each entity, that could be significant. And so it's always important to check and have that continuous monitoring because, as I said before, new companies get added to the list, and there's also DBAs that are added to help identify those companies. And one thing I really want to point out is the reasoning behind the fines I talked about earlier. You can just see this weak algorithms, automatically releasing without review, a lack of focus on sanction locations because it was not monitoring IP addresses. And so when you look at some of this reasoning, it's stuff that you can't do in a large company manually. It's things like monitoring IP addresses. You need technology behind it. And so when I go back to, you name the enemy manual processes, well, the layers of technology to identify, you know, close matches to the SDN list and monitoring the IP addresses. So OFAC is really saying you need to have that level of technology to monitor your supply chain and your supply base. So how do you collect supplier information? How we view it, and I'll get into a little bit more, is you really need to automate as much of it as possible and push it to the supplier through a supplier portal. If anyone wants to share how they're collecting supplier information, great. But as I kind of stated before, 77% are relying on email exchanges. And the issues with that is not only does it take a while, but then you start to have two sides of the spectrum. You have the let's collect enough information so that we can just pay them. What information can we get? Because we have an invoice from them, we need to get them paid. And then there is, hey, let's have them fill out a lot of information that may be relevant, may not be relevant, but you're doing your due diligence, and maybe um, you have a standard set of questions that they need to fill out. And that usually adds more time. When I talk to companies that are prospective clients, they could say, hey, it takes 60 to 90 days to onboard suppliers for them to get through our compliance checks. And when you think about 60 or 90 days, if your company is having some sort of disruption, 60 to 90 days will impact your revenue, or could impact, I should say. And some of those impacts, could be around your website went down because there was some sort of hacker event, and now you're unable to process sales through your website. Or one company I read with public knowledge was that the warehouse where they're um, distributing the vacuums that they were selling had a cyber event, and they shut down the warehouse for, I think it was about 3 weeks. And the company actually sent trucks to remove the inventory there. And it ended up being a big lawsuit, but they couldn't sell that product because it was stuck in the warehouse and the warehouse was shut down. And so if you have to onboard suppliers and it takes 60 to 90 days and you have a critical event where all your warehouse, your goods are in the warehouse and you need to move it to another warehouse and you need trucks to transport that or you need additional suppliers to help make that happen, you can't wait that that amount of time. So what we recommend, and this is probably the only thing that talks about us in the presentation, is just an onboarding process. So the supplier is going to a online portal and fills out their information. They're invited, and that information has to be assumed to be inaccurate. You don't know. And so it starts with the info, which is the name of the person, the company, email address. And then you're asking them in registration for critical information like tax ID, bank account, because you're going to take that info and then you're going to use it to vet them. Your website, where it's their business continuity plans. Do you have any other child labor policies? Any other policies that are part of your onboarding for that specific supplier? And then only trust it after you validate it. And so we're integrated with 1,000 different data sources, and some of those are different regulatory authorities. So looking at credit scores, financial health of companies to determine if they're viable company to do business with. Obviously, we're talking about OFAC, different prohibited lists, but it could be a diversity program. You want to know the diversity status of this company, or it could be their insurance. Is their insurance the level that you need? And so all those data points you need to validate, but doing it manually is just going to take too much time. And so we recommend automating that and validating all that data. So then when it goes through the process of approval of those that are the approvers, they have valid data to say, okay, well, they're not meeting our standards here, here, and here. And then you can mitigate their inherent risk and determine if you want to do business with. And so then lastly is, unless system is connected with other systems and integrate with your ERP, it just becomes another siloed system. And so the value really is to have it integrated with your standard operating procedures and systems. So it's a system of record or feeds a system of record. And so that's how we view the best way to onboard suppliers in an efficient way, but then also ensure that the data you have about the supplier is accurate so you can determine if you want to do business with them. And if any of that data changes, you're aware because you're continuously monitoring it. So I want to talk about tax ID a little bit and some validations. Tax ID is just a basic, data point to do business with a company. So I want to see how many times is this actually failing. And I looked at a company doing business across 60 different countries. So a very large company. And I looked at almost 300,000 suppliers. So, it's pretty decent amount of validations. And almost 4% failed. And so 4% failing, what are the reasons why it failed? Okay, let's just assume nothing is bad. It is they gave the wrong number. They typed in the wrong number. Okay, well, you got to make sure you have that. But if you have that tax ID, it relates to so many other components of the business and risk. So if you have that tax ID and not valid, it's not valid, then you're unsure if you have the name of the company correct. And then you also can't validate bank account information from an ownership perspective. We'll talk about that in a moment. And also then you need that to validate it across prohibited list or COIs or other reputable data sources that you're validating the company against. So this is something that's happening, decent amount of time. So 1 out of 25 about. So Is anyone in the healthcare industry? Is anyone in working in a hospital? Or I think I saw some that might be in pharmaceutical, trying to look through medical devices. So, uh, when we think about our clients, a lot of it, one reason to leverage our solution is compliance. And so healthcare obviously has a lot of compliance requirements, most notably HIPAA. And so when they onboard doctors or or specific types of doctors or clinics, and many of them are suppliers, they're not working for it specifically for the hospital. And so I wanted to look at healthcare credentials. So is this, checking, is this doctor or is this provider, who they say they are and do they have the credentials for it? And it's really, it could be a provider or, a clinic of some sort. And so there were 7,000 checks done. And, when someone failed, it was only one of 7,400 checks that someone said failed, you can't do business with this entity. So one out of 7,000, still a major issue, but not 4%, not the tax ID amount, but still critical. And if you didn't have this check in place, you wouldn't be compliant with your with regulation. And so then I wanted to look at, okay, so what is going on with these suppliers? You know, are they, do they have any other issues? And so of those checks, you had almost 2%, you had some issues in the past. And, a report wasn't submitted within 30 days. You know, say you had the supplier that had, this where it's like there's a couple things or issues over the years that are getting flagged within this credentials check. And so it might not be something critical, like don't do business with this supplier, but it is still identifying potential risk with this supplier that there's flags on this credentials check. And so it's not overt, but maybe when you assess doing business with this supplier versus another, this could be leveraged for negotiation or just determined, hey, talk to the supplier about this and identify, how are they addressing these issues? And another thing is obviously, cyber incidents, 2.3% had some sort of data breach. That's going to happen. Like a lot of companies, it's going to happen. Uh, and it's not saying don't do business with the supplier, but is to be aware of the suppliers and the data breach and understand how they are trying to ensure it doesn't happen in the future. So some of these checks are going to provide you kind of layers, different levels, indicators that aren't necessarily critical alerts, but they are going to represent kind of who that supplier is and what kind of risk you might have doing business with them. And one way to identify some risk is this is something we do for our clients. The news monitoring, so you're looking at the company name and then critical keywords. I wouldn't recommend doing this for all of your suppliers, but I would focus on a certain group or segment that may be critical or high value or a high risk. Uh, Basically, companies that could impact your revenue. And so if you're thinking about, um, if there's bankruptcy or there's some sort of incident, you have a laundry list of name words that only indicate something bad, the company name, and then get alerted when those pop up. And when we think about these data sources, I just went through, tax ID, healthcare credentials. It all just kind of matters, well, like what's important to your business. And I have Certificial on here. We're partnering with them, and they do a certificate of insurance check. And that's something that is really manual in a lot of companies. But there's also, other data sources that are just coming out that we see And they're hugely valuable because they're taking those manual checks and turning them into an API. And and so when I started with Apex about, oh, is it 7.5 years ago? We had about 250 data sources. Now we have about 1,000. So we're constantly adding them. And one reason we add them is that clients say, hey, we would love to have this integrated into our system. This is a new list for bank account ownership validation, or it's a prohibited list that's specific to our country or some sort of industry data source. Is there any like data sources, just thinking about anyone on the call right now, data sources that is always checked with onboarding suppliers or assessing risk, if anyone's doing that at all? See if anyone pops up. Um,
Hmm.
so I wanted to talk about fraud for a little bit. And when you think about fraud, who are the fraudsters? And it's really three groups. There's hackers, colleagues, and supplier employees. And the hackers are the people who are best with technology. The colleagues, unfortunately, they're the ones who know the protocols. And the supplier employees, they have data about your suppliers, like email addresses and potential internal information to make bank account changes or identify ways to steal payments. So I'm going to go through some different data points that can assess payment fraud risk. And just going back to, you know, doing business with suppliers, if there's a disruption in payments or an incident, that can be, disruptive to your business and also create kind of like who's responsible for this um, payment. Sometimes companies will say, you know, those changes were made by the supplier, and so thus it's their result, and sometimes or their not their fault, but they're at fault. And then sometimes companies there'll be some sort of legal within the contract who might be responsible for different types of ways they were exposed. And so within bank account ownership validation, now bank account ownership validation is a process that is growing, or the data validation that's growing over the past, I would say, 4 or 5 years, where, past, I think it's been 20 years since we've had a tool or a data foundation called Early Warning, which is a bank consortium in the US. And it's made up of the largest banks in the US and then a lot of credit unions. And what it does is it takes the legal entity within your um, vendor master and then the legal entity within a bank profile or account, and it matches them. And as I said before, making sure that you have that tax ID validated to make sure that you have the right company name, then it can be is used to match bank accounts. So it's critical to have that tax ID validated first. And so what this bank account ownership doing is just making sure you're paying who you should be paying. And it's done in 4 different groups based upon the region. So in the US, we have a banking consortium, and other countries, typically countries that are focused on preventing money laundering, might have a government data source that will validate um, the ownership of that bank account. Then you have a couple other countries that credit agencies, because they're doing so much business within a uh, country, they'll have the data to validate based upon different payments that are being processed and different information that they're exposed to. And then lastly, there's micro deposits. So micro deposits are, you heard of penny test before? It's like that, but with the micro deposits now, they're getting some information to indicate the legal entity of that bank account, maybe even the tax ID within it. And so then you can validate it. And that's a growing area across a lot of different regions. So these are kind of four different ways to address it. But this bank account ownership validation, when we're thinking about fraud, which some of you may not. I don't know if anyone wants to raise their hand and say if they've had a fraud incident in their organization. Um, but it is how to prevent it or identify it when people are updating their banking information.
Matthew, we had a supplier who had that happen to him, and boy, they were in a heap of trouble for quite a while. Not a good situation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so thanks for jumping in. You remind me of a story I'll tell, but it is, it just creates a major issue with like, and it's a relationship and then there's financial aspect to it. Um, and it typically might expose other issues within the organization. And what I've seen, many companies come to us because there was a fraud incident, and now they have a lot of pressure to update their process pretty quickly. And it becomes a big change management, a big strategic initiative to change how they're onboarding and managing suppliers to prevent fraud. And so I see it a lot. And so I'd like to say that it's not common, but it's very common. And it all just goes back to manual processes. And that's how a lot of companies are operating. When you go from, we work with very large companies, but when you go further down to the smaller companies, it's definitely, I would say it's more prevalent. I don't know if anyone wants to share anything, but I want to tell one fraud story, just to break up my constant slides. So this is a company that came to us a couple of years ago, and healthcare company, and their AP office, they received an email with a request to change the bank account for the supplier. So the supplier emailed the AP office, AP department, and said, we want to request change. And the AP department said, this looks weird. Something's off. Some of this language is off. And they actually said, hey, I'm going to call that supplier. So they called the supplier and said, hey, were you trying to make a bank account change? And they said, no, we haven't. Um, and they were like, oh, okay. We had this request come in. And so what they did is they said, okay, the healthcare organization said, we're going to email you back just saying, hey, uh, we talked, we're not going to change the bank account. Um, and just so it's documented. So I sent that email, and then about 2 or 3 days later, they got a response from the supplier saying, "Hey, since there was some type of fraud going on or some attempt, we would like to change your bank account." And so the healthcare organization changed the bank account, and then about uh, they making payments to the supplier. About a month later, the supplier said, "Hey, we haven't received payment for this invoice," and it's because the person who emailed them and saying, "Hey, we actually would like to make a change because of the fraud," was the fraudster. They were already within their email system, and they were able to kind of intercept that previous email and still get the bank account changed. And so there's layers of, you know, deception, we'll call it. And so when you use tools that are like bank account ownership validation, it gives you ability to really validate if that is the correct supplier. So I want to go through a couple other data points that can indicate fraud with a couple different stories. And I know we have about 20 minutes left, but I'll go through this quickly. If there's any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. So, email address company email addresses, like their group emails, are not good. So the reason why is that I think everyone here is working at a company and they have some security protocols. I have to change my email password a lot, frequently. And there's different checks when I change it. With a group email, you'll have multiple people using the email that could be sales at or purchasing at. And when you do that, you expose the login info to multiple people who then may become a disgruntled employee or an employee that has a financial stress or an employee whose friend is has financial stress or whatever it is, and you expose yourself to potential people and having access to your email that has had the same password for the past 7 years. And so we've seen this where there is a change, and then they realize, oh, okay, um, this group email requested it, and we're not sure who made that change, and it was a fraudulent bank account change request. And so this is one flag. If you're doing business with companies, you can quickly identify this um, within your vendor master and request that all these get updated to personal, not personal, but like company personal email addresses. Address. So one thing is, you could have an address that is linked to a prison. That's one scenario. More likely scenario is that you're sending $10 million a year to a small home or an apartment. I actually, in a previous role, um, I worked for a consulting firm. One of our clients actually was publicly listed and got delisted because they were fraudulently processing payments or processing, um, say that they were getting paid through an internal intra-company that was at a small little house in Hong Kong, and they were getting $30 million from there. And a private equity firm did research and identified this, and you just go into Google Maps and determine that this doesn't seem real. And so identifying if is it a residential address or like how much money are you spending with a small home or apartment, could be valid, but it's an indicator that, hey, we need to look into this. Prepaid phone is an interesting one. So you can easily check this. And the reason why is if someone's providing a phone number, if they're fraudulent, why would they provide you with their phone number that's tied to their name? You want a prepaid phone so that they're not going to get caught. And it's kind of a funny thing to think. And I have a SIM card here. I'm not sure if people use SIM cards. Maybe that's the best image I can come up with. But it's just a simple data point to say, hey, who is this supplier really? Why do they have a prepaid phone? And is this phone number working? If you have a supplier and their phone number is not working, that's kind of a flag too. When we work with companies, many times they'll have 10,000, 40,000 suppliers, and they'll do M&A and they'll onboard 5,000 new suppliers. And that's where you can onboard a spoof company and continue to pay them. And those payments may be, below certain approval thresholds, and they continue to get paid. And I hear it over and over again. And within the large companies, um, you know, this is probably easier to hide a spoof company or spoof supplier. But it definitely happens. And prepaid phone, or is this phone even working? Is a nice little, like, it might not be like, oh, this is definitely like a fraudulent supplier, but it just definitely raises an alert. Another data point that we see more and more is like checking against your employee data. And a bank account would be a huge flag if they're if your employee's bank account was the same as the supplier. But really anything is. Why would any data point that you have on your employee match a supplier? So this is something that we check for all these things, but this is a critical alert that you should really start an investigation into the employee, and it definitely happens.
Matt, could you repeat this point again?
Yeah, sure. So I was just pointing out, so when we think about fraud, um, you have a supplier within your vendor master that you're paying, and they're sending an invoice, and the company is paying that. Now, you want to check your vendor master against your employee data to see if there's any matches. So if you have your vendor master data within the invoice, if it's the same address as a supplier as one of your employees,
Got
there's a connection there.
got it. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Feel free to ask more questions. I love taking a break from talking for a second. Um, so then here are just the three different categories of things that I would monitor or that we currently monitor. And we talked about supplier identity, employee info, and the transactional data. It's kind of I would assume it's out of scope for everyone here. But invoice numbers, there's something called Benford's Law, which says an invoice number is going to look different if it's created by a human versus created by a machine, like a payment processing tool. And so if it's made by a human, they might start it off with like a four, but typically a machine will start with like zero, one, two, three. But if you go, they'll have four, eight, or nine. And so those are indicators of something is weird here. There's also invoice amounts that could be escalating. Like you have a small payment and then it jumps significantly. Or if it's just continuously right below a threshold that internally is known, but externally shouldn't be known. And then not lastly, but there's obviously more, but invoice amounts. If they're even, it's just like unlikely. And like most invoices aren't going to be even amounts um, for suppliers you're doing business with. So that's kind of like continuous fraud monitoring in a nutshell. And so that's kind of what I wanted to go over today. When we're thinking about fraud, it's not fraud, but risk and reputation is preventing disruptions within your supply base. And that's really identifying that risk early enough to do that. And then being able to prevent any kind of incidents working with suppliers that could impact your reputation. And it all just goes back to your manual processes and collecting that information from suppliers and then monitoring it, whether it is, are they on a prohibited list or their financial credit score or, potential fraudulent activity, uh, and getting alerted of it. One issue that people find before they work with us is just they have too much information, too much noise. And so one thing you have to do is make sure you're getting information that you can act on and not get buried in. So you're creating value. And, I'm not trying to, I was told this wasn't supposed to be a sales presentation, but I think that's where we excel. If anyone wants more information, I'm going to share these slides. We have tons more content. Please reach out to me on my email or reach out on LinkedIn. Happy to chat at any point. But that's kind of what I wanted to go over today.
Yeah, and send me the slides so I can get them up on our website.
Excellent. Great. Did anyone have any questions?
Matt, just going back to that previous point you just made about fraud, you should also be checking to see where the invoices are coming from, because sometimes somebody sets up a dummy company and your suppliers are shipping directly to you, but they're being handled by a secondary party that could be another family member of somebody, or it could be a hidden account to invoice you at upper charge. Um, uh, or sometimes it could be just an internal audit that could find some of these internal frauds. So I just thought I'd bring those up.
Yeah. You know, I could talk about fraud for a while, but it I think it's becoming more, I guess there's some recent stories in the news. Um, but after you get, I don't know, Daniel, what size company you're at, but once you get to a large size, there's so much turnover. There might be not be the controls in place, and I trying to identify it manually is just so difficult unless there's some checks that can help identify the high risk, payments or spoof suppliers. Then unless there's some technology behind that to help guide that, it's really difficult to find. One of company that we are now doing business with came to us before because they said the FBI reached out to them because they identified and they looked into it and they had an internal employee who was committing fraud against them, and the FBI was the team that found out. So they would have never known unless the FBI came across this. So it's definitely difficult if you don't have the. Though it's difficult no matter what, but if you don't have the correct controls in place. Any other questions or comments?
Now's the time to ask people. Free questions, free answers. You have a wizard on the line. Now's the time to ask, guys. Couple of things I will point out just for the people who are listening. I did put a link to the survey. So you can give me a survey on what you guys think of tonight's presentation. Any thoughts for the future? There's also a certificate, CEU certificate in the chat window. Click the link. Get these links now because people come back to me 2 days later and say, geez, do you have that link? I didn't get it. Grab it now because once the meeting closes, you can't see the links. So now's the time to do that. Grab the links now, survey and certificate. And I will say to Matthew, what a great job you did tonight. Thank you so much. We're gonna, from the Massachusetts chapter, send you a gift card from Sandeep. It's from our chapter, but it's Sandeep is the person sending it. So it's not spam when you see that. It'll look like spam, but it's not. It's really a small token of our appreciation. So we appreciate that. And
Thank you. And I appreciate everyone coming. And if you have any questions or you want to chat, happy to chat just about does Laura have a question? Is that
yeah,
handy?
I'm gonna stop the recording in case the shy people want to ask questions. Here we go.
I